It was March 14, 1971, on a soundstage in Burbank, California. Charles Bronson sat under hot studio lights across from a young entertainment reporter conducting an interview for a syndicated television program. The reporter had been asking standard questions about Bronson's new film, about his recent success in Europe, about his unusual path to stardom. Then the reporter shifted, leaning forward with practiced sympathy, and asked, "Your daughter Suzanne passed away 2 years ago. How has that loss affected your approach to choosing roles?" The question hung in the air between them. Bronson's face, already weathered and unreadable, showed no reaction. He simply looked at the reporter. 5 seconds of silence passed, then 10, then 15. The reporter, sensing he'd made a mistake, tried to fill the void with more words, but Bronson's continued silence made every additional syllable feel like an intrusion. 30 seconds of dead air on a television interview felt like an eternity. The crew shifted uncomfortably. The cameras kept rolling, and Charles Bronson never answered the question. This is not a story about Hollywood or fame or even about grief. This is about the cost of being strong in public. The choice between performing emotion and protecting what's private, and understanding that sometimes silence is the most powerful response possible. In 1971, Charles Bronson was 50 years old and experiencing success after decades of struggle. He'd grown up in Pennsylvania coal country, one of 15 children in a Lithuanian immigrant family, so poor that Charles had worked in the mines at age 10. He'd survived World War II as a bomber gunner, had spent 20 years taking small roles in Hollywood, had been told repeatedly he was too ethnic, too old, too rough to be a leading man. Then European directors, particularly in France and Italy, recognized something American studios had missed. Bronson's face carried experience that couldn't be faked. His presence suggested violence without performing it. His silence felt more threatening than other actors' dialogue. By 1971, Bronson had become a major star in Europe and was finally getting recognition in America. But success had come with a cost that few knew about. In 1969, Bronson's adopted daughter Suzanne, from his first marriage, had died unexpectedly. The details were private, kept within family, never discussed publicly. Bronson had continued working through his grief, because that's what working-class men of his generation did. You didn't process trauma through therapy or public catharsis. You carried it silently and kept moving forward. Bronson had always been private, had always resisted Hollywood's demand that actors perform their personal lives for publicity. But after Suzanne's death, that privacy became absolute. There were things too sacred, too painful, too personal to ever become entertainment industry content. The interview that day was supposed to be promotional, standard Hollywood machinery. A rising star talking about his films, his European success, his newfound recognition. The reporter was young, in his late 20s, relatively new to entertainment journalism, but ambitious and eager to get beyond surface questions. He'd done his research, had found references to Suzanne's death in old articles, and had decided that asking about personal loss would give the interview emotional depth that standard publicity questions lacked. It was a calculation many journalists make. Personal tragedy humanizes subjects, makes interviews memorable, generates viewer engagement. What the reporter didn't understand was that some subjects cannot be approached through calculation. Bronson had arrived at the studio on time, professional as always. He'd spent his career being reliable, prepared, easy to work with, despite his intimidating screen presence. The crew setting up the interview had been struck by the contrast between Bronson's on-screen intensity and his off-screen courtesy. He'd thanked the makeup artist, had made small talk with the lighting crew, had treated everyone with working-class respect for people doing their jobs. Then he'd sat down across from the reporter, ready to answer questions about his work. The first 20 minutes had gone smoothly. Questions about Red Sun, about working in Europe, about the differences between American and European filmmaking. Bronson answered each question thoughtfully, but briefly. His voice carried that distinctive combination of warmth and distance, friendly but not intimate. He was giving the interview what it needed: professional answers, some insights into his career, enough material to fill a segment, nothing more, nothing less. Then the reporter, feeling confident, decided to go deeper. "Your daughter Suzanne passed away 2 years ago." The reporter's tone was practiced sympathy, the voice people use when they're performing empathy rather than feeling it. "How has that loss affected your approach to choosing roles? Do you find yourself drawn to characters dealing with grief or loss?" The question revealed its own assumptions. That personal tragedy should inform artistic choices, that an actor's private pain should be available for public analysis, that grief, processed correctly, becomes material for better performances. These assumptions weren't unusual in entertainment journalism. They were standard operating procedure for humanizing celebrities, for making stars relatable, for creating emotional content that audiences would remember. What happened next lasted 30 seconds, but felt much longer to everyone in that studio. Bronson's expression didn't change. His body didn't move. He simply looked at the reporter with those pale eyes that had intimidated movie audiences across 2 continents. No anger was visible, no grief, no reaction that could be read and interpreted, just wait. The silence that followed wasn't absence of response. It was response itself, heavy and deliberate. The reporter, after maybe 5 seconds, realized something was wrong. "I ask because I think audiences connect with them." He trailed off. Bronson was still looking at him, still not speaking. 10 seconds. The studio crew began noticing. The camera operator glanced at the director, questioning whether they should cut. The sound engineer checked his equipment, wondering if there was technical malfunction. 15 seconds. The reporter's confidence was cracking visibly. His practiced sympathy was melting into genuine discomfort. He shifted in his chair, looked down at his notes, looked back at Bronson's unwavering stare. 20 seconds. The silence had become its own presence, filling the studio, making breathing seem loud. Everyone understood now that this wasn't a pause. This was refusal. This was Bronson's answer delivered without words. "No." 25 seconds. The reporter tried again, his voice smaller now. "Mr. Bronson, I apologize if..." But finishing the sentence felt impossible under that sustained silence. 30 seconds. Then Bronson spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "Next question." 2 words, not an explanation, not a lecture about boundaries or privacy, not anger or hurt performed for cameras, just direction. "Move on." The reporter, visibly shaken, shuffled his notes. "Let's talk about your upcoming projects." His voice had lost all its earlier confidence. The remainder of the interview proceeded professionally, but the dynamic had completely changed. The reporter asked only surface questions, nothing personal, nothing that approached emotion or private life. Bronson answered each question with the same professional courtesy he'd shown earlier. But everyone in that studio understood what had happened. A line had been drawn, and everyone had witnessed the cost of crossing it. The interview aired 3 weeks later. The segment about Suzanne was cut entirely, leaving a jump in the conversation that careful viewers noticed but couldn't explain. The producer had made the decision immediately after seeing the raw footage. 30 seconds of dead air couldn't be broadcast. But more importantly, Bronson's silence had created something uncomfortable and real in a medium designed for comfortable artifice. Television interviews were supposed to be smooth, controlled, entertaining. This moment had been none of those things. It had been raw and human and completely unperformable. Broadcasting it would have felt like exploitation, exactly what Bronson's silence had accused them of attempting. But the story spread through the entertainment industry anyway. Crew members talked. Other journalists heard about the young reporter who'd asked Charles Bronson about his dead daughter and received 30 seconds of annihilating silence in response. The reporter's career recovered eventually, but he never asked another personal question in his entire professional life. He'd learned something that day about the difference between getting emotional content and respecting human boundaries. Bronson never spoke about the incident publicly. He never complained to the network, never demanded apologies, never used it for publicity or sympathy. He simply continued working, continued being private, continued drawing boundaries without explaining them. Other interviewers learned quickly. When preparing to interview Bronson, producers would brief their talent, professional questions only. Nothing about family, nothing about personal loss, nothing that approaches intimate territory. Bronson's reputation solidified, excellent professional, absolute privacy. Directors and crew loved working with him because he was prepared, focused, generous with less experienced actors. But journalists approached him carefully because everyone had heard some version of what happened when you mistook his courtesy for accessibility. Years later, a film critic writing Bronson's obituary would describe him as a man who understood that strength sometimes means refusing to perform emotion for an audience, that privacy is dignity, and that silence can communicate more than any explanation. The critic had heard about the 1971 interview, had asked colleagues what actually happened. Everyone who'd been in that studio remembered it differently in details, but identically in essence. Bronson had been asked to make his grief into content, and he'd refused through 30 seconds of silence that said everything about who he was. Bronson's career continued for another 3 decades. He became one of the highest-paid actors in the world, made Death Wish and countless other films, built a legacy as cinema's most authentic tough guy. But people who understood his work recognized that his power came from what he withheld, not what he showed. Other actors performed toughness through dialogue and action. Bronson simply existed, carrying weight that didn't need explanation. His silence in interviews, his refusal to discuss personal life, his absolute boundaries weren't media strategy or mystique creation. They were the authentic privacy of a man who understood that not everything needs to be shared, that some things remain sacred, that strength sometimes means protecting what's vulnerable rather than displaying it. Today, in an era of mandatory emotional performance, of celebrities sharing every feeling for content, of grief processed publicly for engagement metrics, Bronson's refusal to answer that question about his daughter feels almost revolutionary. He chose privacy over publicity, human dignity over entertainment value, silence over performed emotion, and in that choice, he demonstrated something essential about what it means to be strong in public. It means knowing what to protect and having the courage to protect it regardless of cost. If this story made you think about what we choose to share and what we choose to protect, consider subscribing. Have you ever witnessed someone protecting their privacy through silence when everyone expected them to perform emotion?